Hi everyone. So today we're here to talk about the fundamentals of story editing. Unfortunately, Kristina couldn't join me. She had another meeting that she needed to attend. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Shane. I'm the Community and Customer Success Manager at Fictionary, and I'm going to be walking you through the fundamentals of story editing using the Fictionary software. Okay, so what is story editing? Story editing is a structural review and revision of your manuscript, focusing on characters, plot, setting, and the story you're telling. So this is different from copy editing or line editing, which looks at the sentence structure, grammatical stuff. We're focusing on that high level story editing so that we can make sure that our clients are telling the best stories possible and delighting their readers. Being objective as an editor is really, really tough. And that's what we at Fictionary aim to do, because sometimes writers will get vague advice from a subjective edit that will just say something like, oh, I didn't really like this, but they don't get feedback on how to actually improve that thing. So you must know as a story editor when story doesn't work. And how will you recognize this? When you're reading through someone's manuscript, if you skim, if you're confused, if the story just doesn't feel right, then odds are there's something amiss with one of the story elements. So the hard way to edit, and this is the old way to edit pre-Fictionary, you would have a manuscript up on one screen and you would have a ginormous spreadsheet up on the other screen. If you're lucky enough to have two screens, if you're not, then you'd have to kind of switch between the two, and it can get very labor intensive. I remember editing this way. It's really tough when you're trying to remember where you are in a manuscript, go and mark something on your spreadsheet, back to your manuscript again. It's just not the most convenient way to edit for your clients. What Fictionary does is fantastic. So we've taken that old way of editing, and it's still the same things you're looking at, but we've combined it into a piece of software that makes editing really simple. And you can actually cut down the time you spend editing your clients' manuscripts by 50% once you really get to grips with the software. And the software is really quick, simple, easy to use. And what Fictionary does for you, one of the really key elements, is that it draws the client's story arc based on the scenes that they've selected as their story arc scenes. Then you as the editor can go in and make sure that those scenes are actually correct. If they're not, you can suggest improvements. If they are, you can tell the writer how fantastically they've done. And we've analyzed the story arc from multiple books, both classics and modern books, to see that we are actually getting the story arc right within the software. So if we take something like Beowulf, for example, which is considered a classic, we can see that it still maps out to this 3-act structure. The inciting incident, Beowulf is chosen as a warrior, that happens at 10%. Beowulf kills Grendel, that's at 25%. That's plot point 1. That's the point at which Beowulf can't go back to the way things were, and he steps into Act 2. Beowulf kills Grendel's mother. That's the midpoint at 50%. When Beowulf is now becoming active in the story. We will go into these plot points in a bit more detail in a moment, but this is just showing you what the Fictionary Story Arc can do. Plot point 2, Beowulf learns his home is being ravaged by dragons. That's at 73%, which is about spot on for the plot point 2. Something terrible happens to the protagonist, and as you can see, it's Beowulf's home being destroyed here. And then at the climax, that happens somewhere between the 85 to 95% mark in Beowulf. And Beowulf fights and he kills the dragon. So he emerges victorious. This is kind of like a standard hero's journey where the hero emerges victorious from that story conflict and battle. How did we arrive at this story arc for Fictionary? Well, what we did, we took all the popular story arcs. You can see some of them on the table here. So Save the Cat Writes a Novel, Structuring Your Novel by K.M. Weiland, even Aristotle's Poetics. So this form of story structure has been around for a long, long time. And we analyzed all of these, and across every single one of these story structures, these 5 key scenes pop up in all of them. So there's something to be said. I mean, they're all called different things in the different books, as you can see, but we've got the inciting incident, we've got plot point 1, then we move into act 2, we've got the midpoint, act 3, we move into plot point 2 and the climax. That's what we've chosen to call these points in the Fictionary software. But it's just so that you can see that we've really done our research and done a really thorough job of trying to determine what the story arc is and where these plot points actually fall. And the great thing about Fictionary is that you can actually see your story. I've shown you the story arc already, and that's a visual that you'll be able to see within the software. But the writer can see their story on a scene-by-scene basis as they go through in Fictionary and fill out each of the 38 story elements that make up a great story. They'll be able to see exactly where they need to improve and where they're doing really well. We'll come on to naming scenes in a moment, but they'll also be able to name scenes so that they can see at a glance what each scene represents in their story. So we like to think of editing in passes, and one pass through your manuscript counts as, you do a read through each time, then you do a bit of editing. You can go back and do a second pass, third pass. It's really up to you how you want to edit for a client. But the goal of Fictionary, remember, is to make that editing time shorter for you so that you can get through more edits for your clients and produce a really quality edit as well. So step 1 on your first editing pass is to write a blurb or examine the writer's blurb if they have provided you with one. You perform a hands-off read-through, and we'll go into what that is in a moment. Keep notes of all your structural changes. Name the scenes, like I said. The client will be able to see what you've named the scenes when you go through the edit. And if you're a writer, you'll be able to name the scenes yourself and easily see your story at a glance. Then you need to select the story arc plot point scenes, so those that we've just covered: inciting incident, plot point 1, midpoint, plot point 2, and the climax. And you'll see if your story arc matches the recommended story arc based on all of our research that I shared with you earlier. And then revise the structure as required. So whether you're a writer writing in our Storyteller software or an editor using our Story Coach software, you'll be able to revise that structure based on all of the things that you input. So writing a blurb. If we take this book, A Comb of Wishes here, we can write a blurb, or we can examine the blurb and see if it works. So a blurb tells you who the protagonist is. In this instance, it's Keela. The story problem: can Keela make her mother live again? So this is the external conflict that she's trying to resolve throughout the story, and the external thing that she's chasing throughout the story as well. Then we need to examine what's at stake, and this is something bigger than her mother's life in this instance. So the blurb reads: ever since her mother's death, Keela, protagonist, feels every bit as broken as the shards of glass known as a mermaid's tears that sparkle on the Caribbean beaches of St. Rita. So when Keela and her friend Lissy stumble across an ancient-looking comb on a coral cave, with all she's already lost, Keela can't help but bring home her very own found treasure. Far away, deep in the cold ocean, the mermaid Ophidia can feel that the comb has been taken, and despite her hatred of all humans, so we've got our antagonist here, our villain, her magic requires that she make a bargain, the comb in exchange for a wish. But what Keela wants most is for her mother to be alive, and a wish that big will exact an even bigger price. So you can see the stakes built into the blurb right there. If Keela gets what she wants, a bigger price will be extracted. So it's ramping up that conflict. And like I said, if you're an editor, you can either have a writer provide you with a blurb and see if it does tell you who the protagonist is, what the story problem is, and what's at stake. Or if you're a writer, you'd be writing your blurb and making sure that these things are included. So we've touched on this briefly. But naming every scene during that first hands-off read through for your first pass, we're trying to name scenes in 3 words or less. And the reason we recommend 3 words or less is because that will really help you narrow down exactly what the scene is about and what the goal is in that scene for your protagonist. So know what your scene is about. You've got yourself an after draft outline. So when you've gone through and named each scene, like I said, you'll be able to see your story at a glance. And it helps define the purpose for each scene as well. And then once you've named the scenes, you'll also be labeling your 5 key plot points, which you can do in the Fictionary software so that you get that nice story arc graph drawn for you. And then what Fictionary also allows you to do is keep structural notes. So you can see on the left-hand side there, the scenes are listed. In the middle pane, you've got the text of the manuscript so that you can read the manuscript and edit at the same time. You don't have to switch between programs, so it's a real lifesaver. And then on the right-hand side, you've got your character elements, plot elements, setting elements, and then you've also got a notes tab as well. So as you go through, you can leave notes to remind yourself as a writer or an editor which parts of the story need to be changed in your edit. So you're leaving structural notes for yourself as you go. And these notes are specific to the scene that you're in. So the notes panel for scene 2 in this case will relate to anything in scene 2, the notes panel in scene 3 for scene 3, and so on and so on. Okay, so story arc analysis. And again, I will bang on about the story arc all day. It's the most fantastic Fictionary feature. It's the thing that drew me to Fictionary when I first found out about it, before I was hired as an employee. So list all 5 plot scenes. And just as a reminder, the plot point scenes, that's inciting incident, inciting incident, plot point 1, midpoint, plot point 2, and the climax. Now, here we're ascertaining, do they actually exist? All 5 of those scenes should occur in roughly the right place in the story, as I outlined earlier. And if one of them or more than one of them don't exist, that's how you know you've got a problem with the backbone of your story and the story structure. Do they accomplish what they need to? So is the inciting incident disrupting the protagonist's everyday world? Is plot point 1 a point of no return for the protagonist so that they can't go back to the way things were? Is the midpoint a change from a reactionary state to a proactive state for the protagonist? Is plot point 2 a moment where the protagonist loses everything? And do you have the most tension and conflict in your climax? And not only that, but is the conflict resolved at the end of the climax? So if those scenes aren't in the right place, they don't exist, or they're not doing what they should, then you probably don't have a strong story quite yet. But that's what editing is for. You can go back and strengthen that spine of your story. So yes, the story arc graph helps you to revise your structure. You'll see here, you've got 2 lines. The blue line is the recommended story arc, which we touched on at the beginning, and the yellow line is the story arc that you as the writer or you as the editor, depending on which role you're fulfilling, have chosen for the novel. And you'll be able to see how closely your plot points match. You can see those little light blue points on the yellow and blue lines. They're where the scenes are marked. So the blue, again, recommended story arc, and the yellow is the story arc for your manuscript. Okay, so the art of scene editing, and we do recommend editing scene by scene at Fictionary so that you can get a really in-depth look at the story. Again, that's whether you're a writer who's self-editing in our Storyteller software or an editor who's editing in Story Coach. And you've got several story elements to evaluate within Fictionary. So on pass 2, you're looking at, are you still happy with the blurb? You're doing your second read through. You're evaluating these story elements of plot, character, and setting at the scene level. Then you can actually start to revise the novel. And what we recommend for kind of a I want to say basic, but that's not the right word. But for we've got like an advanced mode and then just the 15 key plot beats that we recommend. And it really depends how in depth you want to go for the edit. So the 15 story elements are sort of the basic, what we would recommend to look at for a story. The full 38 elements, that's our advanced mode. That will give you a really in-depth look at the entire story. So, scene by scene editing. A scene is a section of your novel where a character or characters engage in action or dialogue. So, it's a slice of that protagonist's life, and we're only sharing the most important thing that's happening in that scene, which is the story goal. And a lot of times we ask the question, we get asked the question, when do you start a new scene? Is it when you're performing a story edit? And you're looking for changes in the point of view, time, and location. So if the point of view character changes during a scene, then that could constitute a scene break and a new scene. If the time changes, so you'll see a lot of time jumps in fiction where the author will jump to something like 2 weeks later and then another scene. So that'd be another time you'd want to break your scene. If the location changes, so you're moving from one location to another and the journey in between said locations isn't actually that important, then you might want to break a scene there as well. So the purpose of each scene, and here we want to know why each scene is in your story. Does the purpose relate to the overall plot, and does a scene have too many purposes? So everything that you include in your novel should relate to the overall plot or that overall story goal that the protagonist is trying to pursue. And if it doesn't, then perhaps the scene isn't necessary and it needs to be cut. Again, if a scene has too many purposes, so it's trying to fulfill too many functions, it could become unfocused, which essentially means that the scene is weak and you need to really nail down that one scene goal that your protagonist is trying to achieve. And if we look at a screenshot from the Fictionary software, you get all these stunning visuals. So this one, purpose of scenes, you'll be able to mark off the purpose of each scene in the Fictionary software. And then you'll be able to see how many scenes serve that specific purpose. Too many of one scene could indicate that it's, that you've used too much of the same thing. You need to vary the purpose of your scenes as well. And then point of view character. Now, this one's really important. The character who is telling the story at any given time is your point of view character. Usually it's the protagonist, but it may or may not be. There are some scenes that the protagonist isn't in, that are told from a different point of view. So example, if two characters are discussing something that the protagonist can't or doesn't know yet, and it's crucial that the protagonist doesn't know for the progression of the plot, then that would mean, for example, that the protagonist won't be in the scene and the point of view character will be one of those people having a conversation, essentially. But we need to nail down who this is, because without a point of view character, the reader won't know who they're following and they won't know who to root for. Okay, so point of view per scene. When you set up a point of view for your reader to follow, you're kind of promising your readers that that's the person that they need to identify with. So if we talk about head hopping for a second, that's where in the course of one scene, the reader occupies multiple characters' heads. So we're switching from point of view to point of view to point of view, all within one scene. What this does is jars the reader from the story, because they don't know which protagonist they're seeing the story through, or which point of view character they're seeing the story through. It leads to confusion in that the reader doesn't know who is pursuing what goal. You'll have a lot of extra words, because usually scenes with a lot of head hopping will have extraneous word count where you kind of hop from one head to another, and it does slow the pacing down as well. If you've got too many points of view in one scene, well, any more than one point of view in one scene, really, it slows the pacing in that you can't really tell a tight scene or writer type scene with more than one point of view, because a scene, if you think about it, is like a mini story, and we need that story arc within the scene to be really tight. And one way to do that is just have one point of view in each scene. And then again, Fictionary gives you all these visuals that you can analyze point of view. So if you know, for instance, that your protagonist is the point of view character in every single scene, and you can make that setting in Fictionary really quickly as well, then your protagonist should be narrating 100% of the scenes. If you know that you have 3 point of view characters and they're the point of view characters that you want to keep, but you start seeing that other characters are creeping in as point of view characters, that might be something you want to address as well. So for multi-point of view stories, you will have different characters as point of view. So a great example of this would be something like Lucy Foley's The Guest List, if you read thrillers, where there are 4 or 5 characters that tell the entire story. One of them is still the protagonist in that they have the most to lose within the story stakes, but different scenes are told by different people. In this case, you can keep track of who's in charge of which scene as the point of view character. Another really important story element is the point of view goal. We've touched on this briefly, but we break this down into 2 parts. So we have an external goal. This is what the point of view character wants during that scene. In a thriller, that would be something like, say it's a heist thriller, it would be a painting that they're trying to steal in a scene. And then we also have an internal goal, which is what the character needs in order to fix their flaw. If you've ever heard an author, editor, anyone in the writing industry talk about a flawed character, what they mean is that the character has suffered a wound in their past that is now affecting how they interact with the world around them or how they view themselves. And it's a flawed opinion that they have about themselves or the world that they're basically trying to fix by the end of the novel. That creates the internal goal, and that stays fairly stable throughout the story, but it might shift and change depending on events that are happening. But crucially, we want to make sure that both these things are related to the plot and that there are massive consequences if the protagonist or point of view character doesn't achieve the scene goal or the story goal, if we're looking at it on a global level. Okay, so when it comes to analyzing the point of view goal in Fictionary, there are a few sneaky things that you need to watch out for. And it's really easy as a writer to get caught up in your own draft and not realize that you've stumbled into one of these sneaky traps. I've done it myself when I'm writing my own novels. So what we're looking for as writers, if you're self-editing again, or editors, if you're editing a client's manuscript, if there's no goal, we need to be aware of that and we need to put a goal into the scene. If there are too many goals, it will dilute the purpose of the scene, which makes the scene weak. So we just need to narrow it down to 1 goal per scene, if possible, especially the external goal. And then if a goal is inconsistent with a character's personality, that could jar the reader out of the story because the character won't seem real enough. They won't seem relatable enough. So just make sure that whatever goals you're giving your character, how they react to either achieving or not achieving that goal must be in line with their personality. If a goal has no consequences, there are no stakes, it's pretty boring. We want there to be a consequence so that when the protagonist or point of view character either achieves or doesn't achieve the goal, they have stakes, they have something to win or lose by doing that, basically. And if the point of view character or protagonist is achieving goal after goal after goal really easily, that doesn't create very good conflict and tension, which we'll come on to in a moment. And readers will quickly get bored with the story and put it down. So we need to ensure that there are enough obstacles in place to stop the protagonist achieving their goals. This is one of my favorite story elements. I think it's great. Entry and exit hooks. So if you don't know, an entry hook gets the reader into a scene. A really basic example of this would be a scene that opens with something like "the phone rang." Immediately, the reader is going to ask the question, well, who's on the phone? Is the protagonist going to answer? What's the nature of the call going to be? You see often in certain genres, a door is knocked at 2 a.m. and the character gets up to answer the door. We all know that a door being knocked at 2 a.m. is not a good thing. And the reader will want to know, well, who's behind that door? What bad news are they delivering? I better stay tuned. An exit hook is similar, but you're creating an element of intrigue that's enough to get the reader to read the start of the next scene. So we often think about readers, say, a lot of readers read in bed. If the end of a scene doesn't have an exit hook, then that's an opportunity for the reader to put your book down and go to sleep. What we want them to do is read into the early hours. So we need to create enough of an exit hook to get them to move on to the next scene. This is where you'll often find, a shocking secret gets revealed right at the end of the scene. The author breaks and then goes to a new chapter or scene and doesn't reveal the reaction to that secret being revealed until the next scene, so that the reader has something to read on for, essentially. And exit and entry hooks help the story flow, and they also help to build pacing. So if it's really fast paced, you want a lot of quick hooks. Setting is obviously very important as well. With locations, we're choosing where each scene takes place, and the method and length of time spent describing the location can make all the difference between a boring and exciting scene. So we need to get the balance right. If we don't give enough setting detail, then readers will fall prey to what's commonly known as white room syndrome. They won't know where they are. They won't know what scene you're trying to paint for them. They need some kind of location indicators to really anchor them in the scene. And then emotional impact is really key as well. Once you've determined the location of each scene, you should ask yourself, how can the choice of location resonate with your point of view character's emotional state? So, for example, in my first novel, I have a scene where the protagonist discovers that his parents are dead, and he does that in his family home. So there's a lot of emotional attachment to the objects in that house. It's the house he grew up in, it's the house he was born in. And there's a lot of emotional stakes riding on that. So it makes the scene even more emotive by setting it there. If I'd set it somewhere impersonal and he'd discovered his parents were dead, yes, it would have still been emotional because his parents are dead, but it wouldn't have had the same emotional impact because there wouldn't have been that emotion tied up in the setting as well. So we can really use setting to drive emotion. When it comes to analysing setting in Fictionary, what we're looking for is a writer self-editing or an editor editing a client. Too much or too little description. We don't want to drown our readers in description either. That can be equally as damaging. Describing setting can slow the pace as well. So if you go into a really, really lengthy description, and this varies from genre to genre, obviously, if you're writing fantasy, it's set in a secondary world, then you would need to describe more because the reader will need to see more. If you're writing in a contemporary genre like romance, for instance, you still need to world build in that the reader needs to be able to visualize the world, but you can be lighter on setting details. But you'll know, depending on which genre you're writing in, what is usual for setting descriptions based on the books you read. So we don't want too much or too little description. Again, we've kind of mentioned white room syndrome. If it's unclear where the scene's taking place, you'll need to add in more details to tighten that up. If a description is not consistent with a point of view character, remember everything your reader experiences is funneled through the point of view character's lens. So if your character is sullen and grumpy, someone like Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, for example, on a hot day, she would probably disparage the heat. She'd hate it. It would make everything harder for her. Whereas if your character is more easygoing, they might love the heat. They might love the joy of a sunny day. So depending on who that point of view character is, it will depend on how you should describe the setting through their lens. If the location is really cliche, so one that I can think of off the top of my head in romance novels that has been done over and over again, unless you're putting a fresh twist on it, is kind of the romantic declaration at the airport, rushing through the boarding gates in the climax. If you can put a twist on it, still use it, but bear in mind that those kind of things are cliche. So you might need to come up with more original ways to set your scenes. And if locations are repetitive, so if you're describing the same things over and over and over again, that can get repetitive and boring for the reader. Even if your book is set in one location, you'd need to think of different setting elements to describe in each scene. Okay, we have touched on tension and conflict, but tension is really, really important. Every single scene in your novel should have an element of tension, and tension is the expectation of something bad that's going to happen. So basically, it's the threat of something bad happening to your protagonist or point of view character. Then conflict is when that bad thing actually happens and we see how the protagonist or point of view character deals with it. But the crucial thing to remember is that tension only works if the reader cares about your character. If a reader doesn't care about a point of view character, then they're not going to care if they're in danger. They're not really going to care about a threat of something bad happening to them. But if you can establish a really strong bond between reader and point of view character or protagonist, then they will care if something bad is going to happen to them. But tension is vital, and we would recommend that it occurs in every scene. Okay, let's move on to story structure and form next, and we'll talk about the art of story design. So Fictionary, I've already covered this. We have all these stunning graphics within Fictionary that show you exactly how your story is looking, how it's shaped. Some of the things, that we can really get into story design about are scenes per chapter and word count per scene. Now, it's important we have some variance here so that every scene is not necessarily exactly the same length, although this can be done and it can be done well if you're doing it intentionally. It's just easier to vary the pacing. So generally speaking, more words in a scene means slower pacing, less words in a scene, shorter sentences, shorter paragraphs mean faster pacing. You can see this with an author like James Patterson, who writes high-octane thrillers. He'll have a 90,000 word novel, but there could be 105 chapters in that novel. So really, he's using each chapter as one singular scene. If you're writing something more literary, you might choose to have longer scenes, longer descriptive passages. So again, it comes down to the genre that you're writing in. And then scenes per chapter, this is just a really easy way for you to keep track of how many scenes you've got in a chapter, because remember, a chapter is a different unit of story to a scene. It's composed of multiple scenes, and you'll be able to see whether something looks off. So if you have a pattern where you say have 3 to 4 scenes in each chapter, but one chapter has 10 scenes in it, you're easily going to be able to spot that and think, oh, maybe there's something up with the structure of that chapter. Maybe I need to break it down a bit more. Similar with word count per scene. If you have a scene with 6,000 words and you normally write scenes between 1,500 and 2,000 words, then that might be a scene that you want to examine, either as a writer, self-editing your own work, or as an editor, editing for a client. Then characters per scene, again, we can see how many characters are in a scene. So you'll be able to see if this is a sequel, which is where the protagonist might be alone and thinking about something that's just occurred to them. You'll be able to see whether it's a big cast scene. So if you've got, say, 15 characters in a scene, you'll be able to see that. And this is really all about balance. You're looking for here, are there too many characters in the scene? Is it going to get confusing for the reader? Do I have enough characters in the scene to support the story goal? And you'll also be able to look at scenes per character. So we flip that round and look at it that way. So you've got 2 ways there that you can really analyze how many characters appear in each scene and whether you actually think that is appropriate for the scene. So a quick checklist for every scene, really, really simple elements that you can look for in every single scene in a novel. Has the scene been named, or can you name the scene? Does the scene have purpose? Does the scene have a point of view character? That's one point of view character. We're not head hopping, remember. Is there a clear point of view character goal? Are they striving for something externally that is causing internal conflict and really affecting that internal arc that we spoke about earlier? Do you have a solid entry hook? Do you or the writer, if you're an editor, have a solid exit hook? So remember, entry hook, we're getting the reader into the scene quickly, and exit hook, we're creating a bit of intrigue to move them on. That's really important for the flow of your story and the pacing. Is the location described enough? Has it been described too much? Are there too many sensory details? Not enough? Is the balance right? So that's another thing we're looking at. Does the location that's been chosen have the maximum emotional impact? And is there enough tension in every single scene? And as we've discussed, tension is key. Without tension, a novel becomes boring. And when a novel becomes boring, readers put the novel down, and we really don't want that to happen. So looking at Fictionary software itself, as you go through the Fictionary software, it acts as this checklist for you. So you don't have to keep, pages and pages of spreadsheets anymore like I used to. You can do it all within the comfort of the Fictionary app. Really simple user interface, easy to use. We've got the character tab, in which you've got those character lists that you can view. So you'll be able to see exactly which characters appear in which scene, which is really helpful for that characters per scene element we spoke about, or the characters per scene visual. You'll be able to enter your point of view character based on the characters that are in the scene from your character list. You'll be able to state the point of view goal, or you should be able to state the point of view goal if you've narrowed it down enough, and all the other character elements that make up the character portion of a good edit. Character arc, point of view character goal from the internal point of view. So those things that we already spoke about, you can fill those all out here. You've got a checklist for plot as well. So if you move over one tab, you can fill in the scene name. This is where you're getting that scene down to 3 words or less so that you can really identify its purpose. You can identify whether it's a story arc scene or not. So this is where you mark whether a scene is part of the inciting incident, plot point 1, midpoint or middle, plot point 2 and climax. That's exactly where you'd mark that off. If you were to change that little node to yes on the story arc, then your options for the purpose would change, and you can pop in inciting incident, plot point 1, midpoint, plot point 2, climax. You'll be able to track how you've opened your scene. Have you opened it with dialogue, thought, description, or action, and have you varied these enough? Multiple scenes that open with dialogue, that quickly, again, becomes repetitive for the reader. You'll notice a pattern here. What we're trying to do is avoid repetition. If you close too many scenes with thoughts in one go, again, that gets dull for the reader. So you can track whether you varied up your opening and closing types enough. You can tell whether your scenes are anchored. This is where you enter your exit and entry hook, tension, conflict, backstory, all these things that relate to plot. You'll be able to see them at a glance. And when I show you the story map at the end of this presentation, you'll understand why this is so powerful. And you've also got your tab for setting as well. So you can pop in your sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touch. You can mark whether they're, if you put a cross in any of these or a tick, you can mark whether it's been done poorly, whether it's been done well. Again, you as the writer self-editing will be able to see at a glance where you need to improve. You as an editor editing a client's manuscript will be able to give the writer the best advice to produce the best edit possible for them. So, story map. Once you've filled in those checklists in Fictionary, character, plot, setting, once you've filled out all those elements, and you can do that with advanced mode turned off, which is just the basic 15 story elements, or if you want a really in-depth edit, you can pop advanced mode on and you'll be looking at 38 story elements. So when you see the story map, it shows you every single thing that you filled in each scene. You'll see the name of the scene down the side, the element down the side here, sorry, and then scene 1, scene 2, scene 3 along the top. You'll be able to identify the scene name in here, and you'll see all of the data that you've input at a glance, so that if you notice that there's a row, a column where you've missed out a lot of things, or a row where there's a lot of crosses, or you couldn't quite identify the story goal, for example, you'll know that they're the scenes that you need to go back and examine. You'll be able to see if you have any trends of things that need to be improved. So if you weren't able to identify an exit hook for 5 scenes running, then perhaps exit hooks is something that you need to work on. And within Fictionary, we have built-in pre-written advice for you to be able to do that. So you just go to the element on the evaluate page where you fill out the elements, click the little question mark next to it. You'll get all this advice about how to improve whatever you're struggling with, whether that be scene purpose, location, emotional impact, tension. And yeah, you'll be able to really improve your writing craft by using the Fictionary software. Okay, so now that we've come to the end of the presentation, if we've got our live viewers, they want to pop any questions in the comments, feel free to do so. I'm happy to answer them. So if you want to go ahead and do that now, that's great. If we don't take any questions in this live webinar, the video will be up on YouTube. It'll stay there and it'll be evergreen. So if you do have a comment, then come and leave it at that time as well. But if you want to find out more about Fictionary and all the great things we do, you can check out our software on a 14-day free trial. Storyteller is for writers. So that's where writers go in. They can write their story in there. They can edit their story in there. If you're an editor, then Story Coach is what we would recommend. You can use the software to coach your clients through an edit, and everything about Fictionary can be found at fictionary.co. I do just want to make everyone aware as well that we have a free Fictionary community that is connecting writers and editors. We've got about 1,000 members in there at the moment. It's a really active community. We have Ask an Editor Anything. You can ask one of our Fictionary certified story coaches like me any questions about storycraft or editing. We have guest speakers coming in to give events. We've actually got one tomorrow with the fantastic Holly Line, the author of Goal Setting for Writers. She's going to come in and help everyone set their writerly goals. We've got the dialogue Dr. Jeff Elkins coming in, and we've got some more exciting speakers lined up too. And we have free events that you can come along to, hosted by Fictionary certified story coach editors. We've just had an event this evening with the wonderful Sherry Leclerc on how to write a synopsis and a blurb. And we've got some really exciting news about that coming up as well for the Fictionary software. And there's a bunch of other stuff in there. We do question of the week. We have weekly accountability where we hold each other to account for our writing and editing goals. There's additional resources. And it's really lively. So if you want to come and find your tribe, join a thriving editing and writing community, you can do that. If you just go to fictionary.co/community, that's fictionary.co/community. You can sign up to the community completely free. Come along to our free guest speaker events, come along to our free editor hosted events, and just join in the conversation. Like I said, really active, really fun place to be. Okay, so we haven't had any questions on the live. Like I said, if you do have questions, then drop them in the comments now. Otherwise, the video will be up on YouTube and it will be there as an evergreen piece of content. You can drop your questions in at any time and I will be along to answer them. Okay, so I think that about wraps us up. Thanks so much for attending. If you have any questions about Fictionary, visit the website fictionary.co or join our fantastic community, fictionary.co/community. Once again, that community is completely free. Okay, thank you very much.